Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Leek.
Welcome back. I am Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Leek. And this is our podcast, Why Is This So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And in this podcast, we discuss, as we have been, topics that or issues that prevent us from being socially just and free as a society. So the goal here is to disrupt the status quo and of racial inequality and inequity in systems. So we have a wonderful topic today, but we invite you to listen and even join in on the conversation later on social media.
And we challenge you to be the change that you want to see. So our topic today,
yes, what are you afraid of?
who?
That's it. That's it, right?
The big bad wolf.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are people afraid of? Like, what are we talking about here?
So it's really like what happens when there is some agents or individuals in a system that are really seeking to disrupt the inequity. So we read in an article of two superintendents that really sought to challenge the anti-racism that exists, or the racism that existed in the system, and specifically anti-Black racism that existed in their systems. And as a result of that, the backlash from the communities were just astounding. And so, Tonya and I had a conversation, and what we realized is that people react that way out of fear.
Yes.
Right? They react that way out of fear.
Right.
They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's happening. This is something new. Or maybe something that's not new. They just don't want it to change. But that's really what we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
It's like really sort of what's behind that backlash.
Yeah, and I think it's a really relevant topic because it's what we're seeing in the news all the time. Yeah. We turn on the news, we hear about different states, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but we hear about these different states who are passing laws, like statewide laws, to basically not allow, funding to be used for anything that's related to diversity and equity and inclusion. We see, things where, topics can't be taught in school. It's like a really big thing. And we happen to live in a state where, we have the freedom in our schools to be able to have conversation. In fact, we've had state laws passed where there's an obligation for conversations to exist in schools, and really to address and combat anti-Black racism. In fact, I remember there was a few years ago, I was a part of a task force that was specifically looking at bias in our state, and found that, bias was on the rise. This particular report was talking about, different types of bias, but, anti-Black racism was one of them that came up. Against other groups, there were various biases against other groups that were on the rise. You and I attended an event, a Juneteenth event, not too long ago, at a Jewish synagogue.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I remember, the woman that invited us mentioned that, just wanted to give you a heads up that, we have guarded security, on site. And, while she was, trying to disarm us or not have us be concerned or fearful, we understood because essentially, anti-Semitic hate is also on the rise. And so, these are some issues that are happening everywhere in this country. It's almost like we've taken like I don't know, 100 steps backwards for some reasons. Like you take 2 steps forward, take 1 step back. You know, it's like
yes.
this nasty,
Yeah.
you know, nastiness, if you will, happening throughout the country.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, that fear, right? So, why is it so nasty? Why are people having such challenges with the idea that there would be some work done to, implement equity, and those social justice, those kinds of things. And I think what it is that we've never really seen it. So they don't know what's going to happen, right? So if I'm part of the backlash, maybe one of my fears is that I'll be left out in some way, right? So we've heard like ridiculous, accusations or ridiculous notions of like, it's reverse racism, like those kinds of things. And I think the other piece, I think the fear there is that, I won't be able to, achieve or move forward if, now you're considering all of these other groups, which is, which I find, well, one is disturbing, right? That one, you would know that there's inequity, but two, you wouldn't do anything about it, or you would stop work being done to address it because of how, because you might not be able to. But I mean, this is really about self-preservation, unfortunately.
And yet there's so much room in this world.
There's so much
for
room.
everybody to be successful.
Yes, that's true.
There really is.
Yeah.
I don't see backlash in everyone being successful.
Right.
Like I don't see a negative side to that. And yet there's this constant pushback that we hear about all the time that we've been witnesses to or victims of, if you will, because we do this work and we'll go into establishments and people will blatantly push back against us. They'll push back against the research. They'll push back against just the fact that we are even there.
Yes.
Like, why do you need to be here? I don't understand. They don't use those words, but they use words that essentially mean, why are you here? We don't want you here, or I don't want you here. It may not be the sentiment of the entire group, but there are those who feel that we're wasting our time.
Yep. Yeah. And I think the other piece of that, or another piece of that, is the backlash very often gets organized.
Yeah.
So there's like this organized effort that, and then we get these policies that say you can't, like I think it's in Iowa, there's a law that, in schools, you cannot discuss structural racism. You can't discuss it, and we know what's happening in Florida, and
Texas.
Yes, in Texas.
And other states.
Yes. Yeah. And so like these laws that, limit the very mention or discussion of racism. So like kids never learn about the history of, and the way that different groups contributed, particularly Black people in this country, the way that they contributed to the building of this nation. They don't get to learn about that.
No.
And it's like, so there's, I have yet to hear of a law that says we can't teach about, Latinos or Asian, right?
There are.
Have you?
Yes.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, no, in other states, Arizona.
Really?
I mean, I don't know if they're current laws, but there were some laws that were passed.
Their names. Wow.
Specifically to stop, where there are large populations of Latino students, to stop teaching about, anything related to their history. Oh yeah, it has
ridiculous.
existed in this country and
That's
other
ridiculous.
states.
So you don't get the full story. So you don't get the full story of the country, right? You don't get
because the contributions of the people in this country.
You don't get the full story,
right?
And I think the challenge is, so two things can be true, right? It can be true that we do live in, this is a really great place to live. The United States has afforded freedoms to people, right? Not in equal amounts, but it has. But the other thing can be true is that, there's been a lot of injustice.
Yes.
Like two things can be true at the same time that may seem, antithetical to each other, but yet they exist. I mean, they exist in all of us, right?
Absolutely.
And so
there's the good and the bad
there's a
in
good
us.
and the bad.
Right,
And
right.
so to only focus on the good, I think really does kids a disservice, all kids.
Such a good point. And in this article that we read from Ed Week, one of the things that pushed these superintendents to move towards creating, systems that were more equitable was really because they heard from alumni who said, we feel that we have not been given a great education because we didn't learn about all these, groups and people, and that we feel like you didn't give us the full picture.
That's right.
And so they're like, this is not fair. All of our students, even though they are majority white, these districts that are in this article are majority white districts, they were saying like, we do have a population of, students of color, that a small population, but there's no reason why this small population should feel like they're not important, or they're not included, or they are not, a part of the community. It's really about belonging in the end. I mean, that's a part of it. That's not the whole thing. But a part of it is, these Black and brown students deserve to feel a sense of belonging, deserve to be affirmed in their school. And can you tell me what parent does not want their child to belong?
Right.
I've never met a parent that doesn't want their child to belong in a school. And I'm not talking about fitting in, because there's a difference.
There's a difference. That's right.
But every parent wants their child to feel a sense of belonging wherever they are. They don't want their child to be othered. They don't want their child to be ostracized, to be discriminated against, to be mistreated because they're different or they are a small percentage of the population. That's unfair.
That's right.
And so no child deserves that. And I think that, when we ask the question, like, what are you afraid of? I'm afraid that in too many places in our country that students of color are going to continue to be marginalized in this day and age. That's my fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the same fear. I also have a fear that white students won't know the contributions of other groups.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the world is diverse, right? It's becoming increasingly smaller, right? As we interact with, different nations, different groups. And so the idea that that you'd be a white student and you don't know the contributions of these other groups. So then what is your lens?
Right.
What is your lens?
Yep.
And what is the extent to which you're able to effectively interact with other groups? So where are you getting your information, when you interact with an African American or a Latino or an Asian, like where are you getting your information? And what are what's your perspective? And so for those white alumni to come back and say, we feel cheated, like that makes sense, right? Because they never knew about the contributions of different groups.
Right.
And so it's the belonging for the groups, but it's also sort of, as a school, like educating, like teaching kids about other groups and then teaching them how to get along, like how do we interact with each other? That's a part of the experience. There's a very social piece. We all know as educators, there's a very social piece in terms of what we're teaching kids. There's the academic, but we're also teaching them about social interaction, right? And so how can we do that effectively if we don't teach them about different groups?
And, I was thinking about some conversations that we had, professional conversations that we had after the George Floyd murder. And in those conversations, and this was actually in the workplace, we were talking about, why it was so upsetting. And what I found that there were, some of my white colleagues who didn't fully understand or appreciate the extent to which, the emotions ran so high. They had empathy and sympathy, but they really didn't understand, the history.
Sure.
And they didn't understand, why his murder was so triggering for Black people. And that was very telling because they didn't know and they didn't understand because they weren't taught.
Right.
They weren't exposed to it.
Right.
And they went through school never having learned about, the history of racism in this country and how this country was founded. And that, Black people who are in this country were not here because they chose to be here. And yet there are people out there who don't know that and don't understand that. And now there are states that are saying you can't even teach it.
Yeah.
And I say kudos to these superintendents who are willing to go against the grain of some in their community who say you can't and shouldn't or whatever, because they understand that, in order for us to create a world where we can live together and get along with one another, their students need to be exposed to the history of our country, which is not a one-sided history.
That's right.
And I think that's what we lose sight of.
Yeah. I think that's really good about sort of not really getting the trigger behind, how or why the George Floyd murder was so triggering, right? But if you've never been taught about Emmett Till, right? As was the case, there's a family member. My brother has a white wife, and she said she'd never heard of Emmett Till.
Yeah, I think I remember you mentioning
that.
Before.
And so it's like, so then if you don't know, if you don't have that history, if you don't really get that, and your perspective is, oh, slavery and Jim Crow, all of that is over, right? That's all over. That was in the past. That doesn't happen now, and you don't know the history. Like you just don't. Of course, you wouldn't get how triggering this is,
right? Because
you don't get how this has been a part of a systemic, and that the Till murder wasn't a one-off, right? It wasn't something that was it wasn't just him,
Right.
So
there's a whole museum in Alabama. I'm actually in the fall going to have an opportunity to go to that museum.
Oh, nice.
In Montgomery, Alabama. And, they honor and remember, they memorialize the thousands of lynching victims that were lynched during the Jim Crow period. Some simply just for being Black.
Yeah.
You hear phrases like driving while Black, and there are people who have no idea what that means.
Yes, right.
Or why that's a thing. And I think it's because they haven't been taught, they haven't been exposed to it, or they choose not to, know anything about it because they don't see the relevance, they don't care.
Right.
And that's not everybody, obviously.
Or they think it's not real.
Right. Or they think it's not real.
They think it's not real. I think, Black people are being, over the top, or, that we should get over it, but that comes from not knowing the history.
Yeah.
The history of our country,
Right. And I don't remember what episode we talked about the history, but, we encourage you to go back and look at, some of our previous episodes. We actually do an episode where we talk specifically about some of the history.
Yeah.
Obviously the episodes are short, so we cannot cover all of the history in 30 minutes, but we do give some background to kind of share with our audience. If you're not familiar with it, we encourage you to go back. I have to look to see what the name of that particular one was, but yeah.
I don't remember.
I don't have all our podcasts memorized.
I don't either.
But what do you think is behind the protests? Of those who are fighting these schools and other schools, fighting this, anti-Black racism or the attempts of the district to really address it. What is behind the protest?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to fear. I think it's part of our title. I think it's fear. I think people are afraid that something will be taken away from them, that something, that their lives will be diminished in quantity or quality if you upset a system that's working just fine for them.
I saw a clip. I may have shared it with you. on social media. I saw a clip from the 1960s, and it was a news reporter questioning some white individuals in the South about what their thoughts were on the Civil Rights Act that was, soon to be passed. And the responses were very similar to what we're seeing right now. So the responses were, I don't think that's necessary. I think it's a problem. Again, I think based in fear, where, they really, the respondents were against, the Civil Rights Act. And thought that it was going to intrude in their lives in some manner.
And it's interesting, we talked about, change management before, but I think sometimes we move right to like doing it and we don't really create like the awareness or the desire. So we know that in companies that have embraced, diversity and inclusion, their profits are higher, right? So we know that there are benefits.
And that comes from the Harvard Business Review.
And that comes from the Harvard Business, yes it does.
That's not ours.
That's right, we didn't just make that up.
We did not.
But I think what happens is if you haven't seen it before, right? So in the 60s, they hadn't seen it before. So they hadn't seen, whether you're in the North or in the South, you had not seen a society yet where there was true equity. So you wouldn't know, whether it works, know.
Right.
And I think even now, I think people have not seen it work, right? We've seen like progress. We've seen, we've seen success in some areas.
Sure. I mean, we benefit from
We
some
have
of that.
certainly benefited.
Yeah, absolutely.
You and I are definitely, having been born in the late 60s, early 70s, definite, absolute benefits of the civil rights movement and a lot of advances that came in the area of social justice. And certainly we are the beneficiaries of that. But that doesn't mean that it was all, the systems in our lives that we sort of worked through and lived through or living through were equitable, right? There were still like some really great gulfs. I mean, just look at the income gap between white people and black people in this country. It still exists. And it's pronounced. Yes,
Yes.
And so, so people have not seen it work.
Right.
And I think the idea of like, oh, this means you're going to cut into my, whatever, I think that's part of the challenge. People just haven't seen, it manifested.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really sad. I also have to give credit to the McKinsey report because they also talk about that the issue that the profitability of companies that make diversity a priority.
Yeah.
So I have to make sure that we give credit where credit is due.
Thank you, McKinsey report.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's interesting when I think about what you were talking about with people, the fear of something's going to be taken away. I think there's another challenge, not just with that, but also there's a challenge where Black children also don't know the history.
Yeah, that's right.
So you don't just have white kids leaving high school without the background, but Black kids are also leaving high school without the background, and kids of other racial groups are also leaving without the background. Because if we think about it, so we know that the Civil Rights Act was predominantly centered around, the history in our country specifically related to Black and white relations, because it was, it was Black people and Indigenous people who were enslaved in this country, and so a lot of that law was centered around those groups. But we know now that America is far greater in diversity and that there are other groups, but there are also other groups, Latin American groups that were, or people of Latin descent who were discriminated against. We know the Japanese were discriminated against, and there's a lot in the history books. We can just go back. So for those who think that this isn't real, go back and look at civil rights cases, because there are plenty of civil rights cases, civil rights cases that address not wanting to teach students English, or problems with teaching them English or what, like there's history just looking at the civil rights cases. So we're not making this stuff up. It's not just like.
There's a reason why European immigrants changed their names.
Yes.
So like social injustice was sort of baked into the system.
Yes.
And those who could escape the racial, and the cultural and the language, inequities did.
Yes.
They did.
Absolutely.
But that didn't work for everybody,
That's
right?
correct.
That didn't work for everybody. So the idea of, sort of like that racial, it's baked into the system. So absolutely.
Yeah, because Italians and those from Irish of Irish descent also face discrimination coming here. And you're absolutely right. They were able to change their names, many of them. Not all of them chose to, but many families did, to thrive, to be able to thrive and survive some of that discrimination.
That's right.
But we know some of the greater areas of discrimination stem from the enslavement period.
Yes, that's right.
And we also know racism and race, first of all, is constructed. And being that race is constructed, it was not constructed for any good reason.
That's right.
There was nothing good that came out of creating this concept of race.
Right.
It was specifically to create a hierarchy based upon the tone of people's skin and where they descended from.
That's right. The caste system.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So this is, there's a lot of history here, and kudos to these superintendents who say, I'm going to push against the grain because we deserve to have a society where everyone can live and be treated fairly and equitably and have, opportunities extended to them, access to, things that everyone should have access to. They believe that. They believe that it also creates empathy when you understand the history, especially the history of discrimination. Like this is these superintendents, and any superintendent, because we work with school districts, any superintendent who has taken a stance against the grain in their communities and has said, listen, we are going to address this. Kudos to you.
Kudos. And done it despite the backlash.
Exactly.
Right? So they didn't back down. They didn't say, okay, well, they sort of forged through to keep,
Because they understand that this is good for all children.
Yes, that's right.
It's good for all of them.
That's right.
Not just one group.
So Jenny Reisner of Ames, Iowa, kudos to you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And there's the other, trying to look for the name of the other one, but kudos to you.
Yes. Absolutely. And so, when we think about these conversations, we hope that these conversations will continue. We hope that people will say, listen, there's nothing to lose here in learning about other groups of people. We hope that people will rise up and say, okay, let's do this. And I mean country, throughout this country, not just in any particular state. But I hope that people will rise up and say, this is important enough that we need to push through this. Push through the backlash, push through the discrimination, push through the fear, even. I used to say fear is false evidence appearing real. Push through that so that we can create a better society for all of our children.
That's it.
Because they deserve that.
They do. They do. Kudos also to Greg Palmer.
You found the name?
Superintendent of Brewer, Maine. So thank you for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
It has been.
Yeah. And we invite you to join our conversation through social media. And let us know, what you think about this. What do you think is behind the backlash when it comes to, social justice and anti-racism? What do you think is behind it? We'd love to hear what you have to say. So I'm Erika.
And I'm Tonya. And thank you for joining us.